So we're going to get into today the rise of two new political parties, or newer, I should say. One of them we're already familiar with, the Federalists. And that was going back to when we talked about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There was a group of people who wanted a stronger federal government, and then a group who preferred that the power of government be somewhat limited. Okay. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a guy that we're going to talk a lot about very soon. Even though he was part of one of these political parties, he, like George Washington, did not like the idea of the country splitting into factions and dividing into parties. Remember, we talked about George Washington was big on unity and avoiding a political split. So government people were becoming selfish and more concerned about personal gain than what was good for the country. And this did not sit well with many Americans. They thought, okay, our government's supposed to be protecting us and helping us, but there are certain things that they're doing that seem a little bit more selfish than what's going to be helpful. And so we start to see a split into two groups, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And this, again, to review, is exactly what George Washington, our first president, feared. And that's why in his farewell address, his last speech to the American nation as president, one of the things he said was, don't divide into political groups. But nonetheless, it was inevitable, and two parties were emerging, like we said, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And along with this came a feud between two of Washington's cabinet members, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who would eventually become our third president. So looking at the two groups, on one side, you had the Federalists, and they were led by a guy named Alexander Hamilton, who many of you might be familiar with. So if you're into the Hamilton musical, there's a lot of information there that might help you better understand the Federalists. So a little background behind Hamilton. He grew up in poverty. And usually when people grow up without a lot of resources, that makes them a hard worker. It's not to say that people who are wealthy are not hardworking, but usually if you want to get something and you don't have access to it, you're going to work harder than the next person to try and get that. He was also a very formal speaker, a very educated individual. His economic philosophy said we should focus on manufacturing goods, or in other words, making products, and also trading with other countries. And this was modeled after Great Britain, which was the most successful and the richest country in the world back in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we saw the growth of urban cities, and Alexander Hamilton encouraged people to move to larger cities like Boston and New York City to bring their money, to bring their business. And with that comes ideas, and that would help our economy grow and become successful. He also favored and was supportive of creating a national bank to help issue loans to make money for the government, but also to help the people out. So many Federalists felt that a national bank was a good idea, and the government had the right to create a national bank as part of their structure. In terms of government, many Federalists, like Hamilton, wanted a stronger federal government, at least stronger than what it was before the Constitution. And even once the Constitution was written, Hamilton and Federalists had this yearning for a strong federal government. They felt that a strong federal government would help commerce, it would help control and protect the nation, but it would also control unruly mobs like we saw in the Whiskey Rebellion and in Bacon's Rebellion and in Shays' Rebellion back in Revolutionary times. So sometimes those revolutions, when they get really violent, or thinking about the French Revolution over in France, Federalists said we need to try and prevent these violent things from happening. It's not that we don't think that change is a bad thing, and we want to listen to the people if they think that the government's doing things wrong, but rebelling and revolting violently like we saw with those other examples is not the way to go. So those were the Federalists. And also they wanted to have a strong alliance with Britain. So they said, push come to shove, if we're going to side with a country, Britain is our best ally because they're very wealthy. They have a strong and powerful military because they're wealthy. And so even though we've had our differences with them in the past, we want to ally with the people who have the most resources, and that at the time was Great Britain. On the other side was a group known as the Democratic Republicans, and you can consider these like the new wave of anti-federalists. So many of these characteristics of Democratic Republicans are very similar to anti-federalists, and they were headed by a guy named Thomas Jefferson, who you're probably also familiar with. Now, Jefferson, unlike Hamilton, came from wealth, and he grew up with a lot of riches and resources. And even though he was wealthy, he was an informal person and had a very casual demeanor. So he was somewhat laid back, and that explains his philosophy on government, what's known as a laissez-faire or a hands-off type government. His economic philosophy was farming is the backbone of our country. So if we want our country's economy to succeed and grow, farming is the best way to do it. Why? Because people are always going to need to eat. People are always going to need farmers to produce certain things, even things that you don't eat. Some of the items that are most commonly purchased and traded come from farm materials or come from earth resources. And that's where Jefferson said, if we want a sustainable model for economic growth and for a wealthy country, farming is the best way to go, not manufacturing necessarily. It wasn't that he thought manufacturing was a bad idea, but he said we should put more of our efforts and spend more of our money on helping farmers and agriculture. Government, Democratic Republicans and Jefferson and others who followed the Democratic Republican model believed in a limited federal government. So much like the Anti-Federalists, they did not want a repeat of King George and the English oppression that caused us to want to declare independence in the first place. They feared that a strong federal government would try to overrule the Constitution and take power away from the people. So even though Federalists said the Constitution is the law of the land, it's in Article 6 of the document itself, there were still skeptical Democratic Republicans who doubted that our government, our federal government, was going to stick to that. They felt that if our government became strong enough, eventually they could muscle their way around what it says in the Constitution, even though the Federalists said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to follow what it says. And because of that, Democratic Republicans said, all right, we're going to hold you to that, and we're going to expect that you follow the Constitution literally and strictly. Whereas Federalists said, well, we can liberally look at the Constitution, which basically means if it's close enough, there's loopholes and there's ways around certain things in the Constitution, as long as it's good for the nation. Democratic Republicans said, nope, if it's not in the Constitution, you shouldn't be able to do it. So when we talk about the national bank, Democratic Republicans said, nowhere in the Constitution does it give the federal government the right to create a bank. So therefore, the federal government can't do that unless all the states agree to it. And in terms of an ally, they were skeptical of the British. They were still spurned by the wrongs that the British committed. Remember, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote it with a passion because he was angry with the British government. So he said, I don't want to ally with them. They've proven that they can't be trusted. France came to our aid, and they helped us in the war against the British. So they're the ones we should ally with. They helped us. They gave us resources. They had our back when we needed it. And as a return of favor, we need to have their back in this case. So those are just some of the different characteristics and the differences between those two political groups. And hopefully you have a little better understanding now between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, or between Hamilton and Jefferson.